I'd like to introduce you to Lecture 8, which is Chapter 12 of our book. I'm going to be looking at how we practice agriculture, and particularly how do we raise our food, and what are some of the consequences of the way that we provide ourselves with food. So what we'll be covering is a little about modern agriculture, and we're going to see that through this lecture and also through a couple of videos. How does modern agriculture affect our environment? We're also going to look a little bit how it affects our health too. And then we're going to focus on meat production, not because I'm encouraging it, but because this is an ineffective way that we do grow food, and we live in a very meat-based society, whether it's poultry or cattle or lamb or whatever, and we inherited that from ancient ancestry, very likely. So we do see in a lot of countries that are particularly developed countries, meat tends to be consumed heavily, and that there are significant consequences of that. And we're going to be looking at mostly the consequences to the environment, because I'm not an expert on the consequences of our health, and I don't think there are as many good studies out there yet that really support it one way or another. But we do know the environmental consequences and the consequences to sustainability. And we'll look at also how food systems change in future, of looking at how should we change our eating habits to make it more sustainable and environmentally friendly. So it may not be surprising to some of you, but agriculture, as we do it today, believe it or not, goes back over 10,000 years, looking at probably 15,000 years. Your book is a little funky about that date. But our agriculture developed from when hunter and gathering societies. It means people that hunted and just gathered food, gathered plants, and ate berries and nuts and grains and things like that. And they eventually settled in areas either temporarily or eventually permanently. And they found growing crops and herding animals and corralling them paid off better than having to go hunt and gather. And they learned that that type of method takes less work, it takes less people, and it provided more food than people actually needed at the time. The problem is it also started exploiting resources that they used to grow the plants and animals. And they found themselves using up soil, and also finding difficulty getting grains and other things to feed their livestock. So we did learn some lessons in early agriculture and started doing it a little more prudently, or what I would call sustainably. And people learned by actually selecting certain crops that grew better or required less resources or were more nutritious, paid off. And this again started about 10,000 years ago. Early agriculture probably started about 20,000 years ago, but agriculture the way we do it today, where we actually intentionally breed certain crops to eat, and the example is given corn. The modern corn today, this is what it looked like when our ancestors were eating it. This is called teosinte, and it's native to central and northern parts of South America. So at one time, corn didn't look like this. It took tens of thousands of years of breeding to get it to look like this, which made it a little more difficult to grow, because you're taking a weed that grew very well and making it into a very manicured plant. It's subject to disease and subject to being fed upon by insects, because it's a nice juicy plant, but it gives much more yield than this. You can make very little out of this compared to this corn. And considering that corn is a major crop for the production of a lot of things, it's important to have this big, fat corn. And you're going to see a video on the history of agriculture, and it's going to look at also corn as one of those crops, including livestock. So, we went to this sedentary lifestyle that eventually developed into cities, and we started streamlining the number of people we needed for agriculture. At one time, a whole family grew the crops just for them, and maybe a little more for feeding other people. But as cities grew, we learned that we needed less and less people to grow food for more and more people. And this came with the advent of fertilizer, with technology, and better breeding of crops. And it got to the point where we lost a lot of agricultural jobs, and people had to move into trades and other things to do. So agriculture at one time was the king. And in some countries, we still see hunting, gathering, and minor simple agriculture still taking place. So to reiterate some of the important points, people started out hunting and gathering food, wild food, stuff that you just came across. And what they would do is deplete it from an area They would overhunt the area and then move on and keep doing this. But eventually people ran out of space. The earth started getting filled with people about, 200,000 years ago, and there was nowhere to go without running into competition. So people settled first in small families, then into groups and extended families, and eventually into tribes, and eventually villages and cities. And with that came the advent of better and better agriculture. And the better agriculture came when we started to breed and create what we call domesticated creatures. And we're not going to go too much into the technology of this. The importance is that we were able to grow crops that benefited us and produce much greater yields, and were even more resistant to insects. We also, around that time, domesticated dogs and used them as guards for hunting, and and in some cases we still do that today. But the major animals that we started cultivating were cattle, which was one of the earlier ones. We had dairy and beef cow many years ago, about 8 to 10,000 years ago. Wild game, which eventually became game fowls, which became chicken, pigs, sheep, and actually sheep and goats go well before pigs. Goats were probably less domesticated than other creatures, but still, they look nothing like the ancestral animals that we used to hunt. And a lot of this agricultural activity occurred very early in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and also we ignore China and South America. People separately developed agriculture throughout the world. So it was a common thing that came with settling. But what agriculture also did was that it created a land use that had to be maintained. We had to learn how to fertilize, and that goes back thousands of years ago, which is incredible to think about. People use everything from ash, means burnt wood, which is still done today. It's sometimes called slash and burn agriculture. We use dead animals, fish. People use their own feces. When I was doing work in Jamaica many years ago, I was doing a project. I lived in a little place that had sewage. My sewage, when I flushed my toilet, it would run out into a ditch into the street. And I would visit people in their little shanties, and they didn't have the toilets that I have, and they would basically poo and pee in a bucket and use it as something called night soil. They'd mix it with a little soil with vegetable matter, and they fertilized the crops that I ate. It was a source of nutrient, and that went back to their ancestry when they did it in their ancestral countries, but predominantly parts of Africa, and also we had Indians there too, and parts of India. I mean, the real India in Asia. So as agriculture went on, in certain cultures, its practice was centralized. And the Romans, the Greeks, and other cultures started basically, had recommendations and guidelines, and they started having literally almost like corporate or government farms, which you saw throughout Europe. And, depending on the politics, farms took on those characteristics. And people started specializing the types of crops they're going to eat, and even use practices like rotating to have availability of seasonal crops. We do know that different cultures, particularly Native Americans, again, used many of the same practices that ancient people did and modified it to their local needs and tastes. But people, for generation after generation, limited the amount of crops that they ate. They picked certain favorite foods, usually a handful of foods, and that became their staple. They didn't have to rely on just finding something. That means we found a zebra, we found this antelope, that. They could have consistent foods forever. And think about our choices at fast food restaurants, or think about in general, most fast food restaurants sell the same type of stuff. Most of our cuisines are similar. It might vary based on ethnicity, but still, we have certain things, certain ingredients that make up, most of our food. And we have very much fewer ingredients than ancient cultures did. So understand that agriculture is an old practice, but it really worked well as we started looking at larger civilizations. We adapted agriculture to it, and it worked well for us, and particularly industrialization and the advent of modern chemistry with artificial fertilizers and things like that was a very big boom to agriculture. So we're going to get away from historical agriculture and go next on how do we do agriculture the way we do it today? What is the philosophy of agriculture today? So guys, our modern, what we call modern agricultural practices was part of what we call the Green Revolution. And this started about the 60s, and much of this had to do with, believe it or not, the exploitation of petroleum and other materials, and particularly plastics, because all your lives you've been familiar with plastic, but plastics really become really popular to the late 40s, 50s, and really mostly in the 60s. So this has improved a lot, agriculture, and better gas mileage vehicles, better farm equipment has really made some improvements to the point where we're growing more crops per farmer than any other time in history. And a lot of us tried to export this green revolution across the world, which didn't work out too well because it's a very expensive way to do things, requires a lot of fossil fuels and just a lot of infrastructure in general, and fertilizer and all of that to maintain those type of farms. So particularly in the Peace Corps, a lot of my friends joined and helped set up agricultural systems that did fail in these developing countries particularly, which led to famines and war and a distrust for American and European practices. And we probably tend to be the most intensive as far as what we put into agriculture, probably followed by, some of the European countries, particularly Northern and Western Europe, and also some of the larger cities that we find in the South American countries. Something else that gave a big boom to agriculture is when, in early agriculture, you basically had to move to where the water was and do agriculture where the water was, and somehow find a way to transport that through putting farms near flood zones, in floodplains to get, to basically get your crops watered, or to importing the water by bucket or by aqueducts. That was which was used a lot in ancient Greece and in Rome. So today what we can do is irrigate. We can now, instead of just waiting for rain or river flooding, we can now water crops. But again, this takes a lot of effort to pump water, to move water, and in some cases to store water. And then I mentioned earlier the whole idea of our growing chemistry. In the 1960s and 70s, we had this big boom in what's called synthetic chemistry, and we can literally make any molecule we wanted to. And this was very important, particularly with synthetic fertilizers, which required, petroleum products and other resources from the ground. So, so we got away from a lot of our natural fertilizers, a lot of plant waste as fertilizers, which does cause, spread of plant diseases. So again, this has been an incredible development, and also the development of particularly synthetic pesticides. Because guys, if you were to grow crops without pesticides, you'd be lucky to get 1/3 of your crops. On a good year, maybe 1/2. So pesticides have really been a boom, and it's been making life affordable, of course, with the consequence of pollution. And the same is true for synthetic fertilizers, because we tend to sometimes over-apply them to push the crops to produce. Right around the 70s, we found several researchers discovered ways to genetically modify organisms by either modifying the genes of that organism or adding genes from other organisms into another, which we call transgenics. And this didn't really become feasible until the mid-80s with the development of genetically modified crops. The most famous and first really one that never made it successful because of the cost was called the flavor saver tomato. And what was interesting is I was in graduate school at a lot of time working on my PhD. A lot of time this was going on, and I was in a school of ag, and researchers were coming up with all these ideas about plants that contained animal proteins. One researcher was working on a corn at University of Illinois that had egg white in it, so we could have plants that were high in protein, particularly egg white protein is very valuable. The flavor saver tomato was a tomato that didn't spoil. Okay, and that was, I forgot, that was developed in a university cooperation with one of the biotech companies at the time, agricultural biotech companies. And the tomato did not rot for a long period of time. It could sit for weeks without spoiling, which was incredible, and it could ship without bruising, which was a boom. And to do that with other crops like bananas and whatever was incredible. So when we hear about genetic modification, it's hard to not have anything around you today that has been somewhat genetically modified. And the genetic modification really, to be honest, does not vary that much from selective breeding. I mean, selective breeding is in a way a slow genetic modification of organisms. What we do today is a little more high tech. And it is difficult through selective breeding to breed two different animals together, but it can be done. But not as weird as putting egg white protein into corn. But again, this is a field I'm familiar with. I've published on this field and did work in this field actually in industry. And a lot of it is done very precisely and very safely. And there's nothing magical about it. The DNA that we use, that we put into these organisms, even if it's synthetic DNA, guys, is nothing deadly. You're eating DNA and weird proteins and compounds all the time. I'm much more concerned about synthetic pesticides and herbicides and many of the compounds we work around us every day, many of the household sprays and the chemicals you put into your car to make your car run, the lubricants and the petrol, are probably more deadly in the long term than any genetically modified organism that we can come up with. Now, a very important part of this class is for us to understand and really appreciate our role in agriculture. And our role in agriculture is as a consumer. And I can't stress that more. Stores don't stock stuff that you don't want. Restaurants don't prepare meals that you don't want. If nobody buys them or never buys them again. Farmers won't grow what you don't want. So everything that you see in a grocery store today was not front-loaded. That means not dumped on you and you have to choose it. Your selection over a period of time, surveys that go out, even just simple restaurant surveys determine what people are going to serve and grow. And this is true globally. There are countries that grow crops that they don't eat, but they use it for export, whether people are going hungry or have trouble getting their own food while they're exporting it to other countries. So, and agriculture in general is meant to feed a lot of people. Agriculture produces a lot of pollution. It does produce a lot of waste. We're going to eventually have a special topic on food waste because we are part of the problem. We overproduce crops. We broke crops down into basically household consumer crops and then commercial crops, which go to restaurants, conventions, all that type of stuff that provides commercial food. And the thing about that is that we see this happen with the COVID pandemic, with other situations when food becomes scarce or things happening where agriculture goes down. It is very difficult for farmers to shift over from one market to another. So there are farmers that they're just used to sending food off to caterers and places that do the packaging of food, and particularly for group use and restaurant use. It's a totally different supply chain than the vegetables you see in your grocery store. And it's difficult to convert over from one market to another and one sector to another. And I've seen this at University of Illinois with the crops, is we have crops that grow for just, oranges, let's say, for orange juice. Tomatoes that are only grown for ketchup because that's the only quality of material that they can produce. So we have specialized crops even for catering, for home use, for certain types of cooking. Farming itself is taking up less land than it used to take up. Now a lot of land is taken up, of course, by other commercial entities. But the thing is that it works the land hard. It erodes the land, it wears it out, it puts chemicals into it, and farming compresses the land. And the classic example was the Dust Bowl in the United States many years ago, and we see similar things still occurring today. China, as it says it here, has dust bowls. We work the soil so much, it loses its texture, it loses the topsoil, and it becomes worthless. And the problem when that happens sometimes is we chop down forests. I've seen this in the east side of Puerto Rico, where growers were chopping down tropical rainforests outside of the protected areas, but still tropical areas, beautiful areas, and to plant tomatoes that went in a ketchup. And after a while, the tomato field wears out because the farmers are not using good practices. They're trying to make money, basically, because believe me, the ketchup market doesn't have a big payoff for the cost that they get for growing those tomatoes. So, so the farmers do the best they can, but they can't be the best stewards of the land. And that becomes an issue. And then that land wears out. They have to let it sit. It can get repurposed because probably it won't grow back to a rainforest or a jungle ever again. And that's a wasteful thing to do. So a lot of the things that we do to improve crop growth tend to work against the stability of the soil. So irrigation, we see speeds up erosion, and we can look at that. I have a lab if you want to do it, where we can actually look at how water droplets impact the structure of soil. Okay. Also, what we do is called shallow irrigation, and that means that the water goes down to a certain depth and no further, and that causes a process called salination. This was covered in our soil coverage when we talked about soil. Over irrigation could also leach out minerals from the soil, nutrients that we now have to add and keep adding as the irrigation water washes that stuff out, because the soil's not used to that much water coming in. And then to make up for leaching, we tend to over fertilize. Now the farmers are much better about making sure that the fertilizer is contained, because the Environmental Protection Agency, holds them accountable for that. But still, stuff gets out. And one of the big problems, again, of agriculture is that if soil does go bad, agricultural soil, and you can't use it anymore, it undergoes a process called desertification. It doesn't turn into desert, it turns into desert. And that soil, then you have to spend a lot of money per acre to bring that soil back. And I've seen that at the University of Illinois. I actually had to do those calculations in a class I was taking on agronomy. It was amazing to think about the cost it can take. And farmers just don't have that kind of money, considering that they have to have all this expensive equipment to do what they do in order to produce the amount of crops they need to, and the quality of crops. Now, because farming requires a lot of machinery to do now, I mean, we have to, it's automated. Every step is automated. It requires a lot of transportation. Trucks, trains, planes, and then we have over-the-road trucks, and then local trucks, and then small distributor trucks. So we have sometimes 3 levels of trucking industry that distribute food. And probably the most inefficient is the stuff that brings the trucks that brings food to the grocery stores individually, or to restaurants individually. Water quality is also affected by soil erosion. So farming is a big polluter. It's a big contributor to pollution. And unfortunately, the way we do farming, we can't avoid that, and for the level of farming that we want. So please read about this in your book, and pay attention to certain terms. Because when we start looking at water quality particularly, there's a process called eutrophication, which means water becomes so enriched with fertilizers, it actually ends up disrupting the food chain balances, which can cause fish kills, large fish kills. Also, a condition called hypoxia can occur, where certain organisms get overfed and they use up the oxygen in the water, and literally it's like sucking the oxygen out of our own atmosphere for these poor creatures that live in the water. So understand the what we call the farm to market or your home system, what gets your food to the table, whether you eat at home or a restaurant or at a convention or at a wedding. It doesn't matter. We have seen the most energy intensive farming imaginable in our history, in our time, and it's getting worse as we start importing crops from further and further away, particularly specialty crops that we sometimes have to bring in by ships, literally transcontinental ships and airplanes. Now, I don't like giving statistics about usage, but we have to focus a lot on water. Water is a human right. It's one of our scarcest resources, and it's a resource that we have to clean every time we use it. And that's expensive. So when we look at water availability, particularly in agriculture, I'm going to say this is probably true for the United States, but about 2/3 of the fresh water that we use goes into agriculture, either directly or indirectly. That means it either goes into irrigation water or into the water that's used to run machinery, that's used in transportation, or to use to even process crops, because we know you don't just eat a whole cow. You eat processed foods a lot, vegetables, canned vegetables, whatever. That all draws upon our water resources. And the problem with farming too is they don't use like city water. It's too expensive. So a lot of them drill their own wells, which competes for city water, and sometimes can dry up an area. It could pull water out of aquifers too quickly, and this creates problems. And we have actually water wars in the United States, and particularly Texas is great for that. At one time, people are killing each other over water. Is that we put priorities over who gets water. Is it agriculture? Is it commercial, or is it household? So what do? You have to weigh food production with household use, with manufacturing and commercial entities. And we need them all equally. So please, again, read your book about these issues. And particularly, guys, when we start draining too much water out of the ground, we start getting a phenomenon called subsidence, which means the ground does sink. And it becomes a fragile place to live, to build on, and to do further work upon. So we have several other issues to deal with when we look at agriculture. So there's the pollution, there's the water usage, there's the pesticides, which, guys, pesticides are toxins. And pesticides can be used to kill insects, fungi, worms, particularly worms called nematodes, not earthworms because they're good, rodents that get into grain crops. We have to literally use pesticides in the cattle industry, and even if you raise horses or goats or chickens, because they get pests too, and they get worms and they get bacterial infections. So sometimes antibiotics, which is actually a type of pesticide, gets its way into the food. So it's not just plant crops, it's animals, and it's even in the processing we have to use pesticides, and sometimes even in food storage and transportation. Believe me, you don't want cockroaches and beetles and other stuff all in your food. So we have seen, again, this incredible growth of pesticides. And some of the pesticides are proven really bad, like DDT, which was used many years ago. It's not allowed to be used today in many countries. Some countries have to, because it's used particularly for mosquito control, particularly mosquitoes that can transfer malaria and some other really deadly diseases. But this has been a problem. And the problem with pesticides is it does harm you. Now, we do have agricultural laws that were passed, like the Delaney Act and others, that minimize the pesticides in the food. And some people even petitioned to have 0 pesticides present in foods once it makes it to your plates, but that's ridiculous. We can't do that. But again, think of the consequences of not using pesticides. Is food would be more scarce, and it would probably be 3 times the price to get. You know, because pesticides are pretty cheap, and they do save money. I know that from being on farms in Illinois and working with farmers and looking at experiments that compared pesticides versus non-pesticide fields. And guys, the bottom line is the farmers need to make money, enough to keep themselves alive, not to be rich, but enough to keep doing what they're doing. So another issue in agriculture is genetically modified organisms, not just crops, but also animals. And even when you think about if you drink alcoholic beverages, genetically modified yeast. The goal of genetic modification is to improve crop efficiency and to reduce disease and crop loss. Because you as a consumer want perfect crops. You don't want bug bites in your crops. You want crops that last on your shelf, that are tasty. And you also want crops that we could, try to reduce pesticide use. So a lot of what we do is we grow fields of crops that could resist certain pesticides so we can control the weeds. What do weeds do to crops? They compete for soil, they compete for nutrients. So it lowers the yield and it lowers the quality of that crop. But if we put a lot of herbicide in the soil, weed killer, that harms the crop too. And it's always been a delicate balance. So now what we can do is we can put a pesticide, and Roundup was the first one we made crop plants resistant to, where the crop plants don't die, you get a beautiful yield, but it kills the weeds. and you can control the amount of Roundup. You can keep it at reasonable levels to kill the weeds. And then the healthy crop plants outcompete the weeds. We could put what's called Bacillus thuringiensis, what's called toxin, Bt toxin into corn. Now, toxin is a toxin to insects, not to us, at least not this form of the toxin, and it will never change into our form, believe me. So we can put chemicals in plants that are natural pesticides that you can eat the toxin and not harm you, but it harms insect guts. And now we're not using the other types of pesticides which we know directly harm you. GMOs, again, can be used to make crops that produce more. We have trees that can produce twice as much wood fiber in the same space as regular trees, and it saves on forests. It saves on cutting down trees. So there's all sorts. I mean, you'd be surprised the number of genetically modified crops that are out there that you are eating, you don't even know it. A lot of genetically modified crops are used to make them drought resistant, salt resistant, you name it. We have it. Even some that we could add vitamins and vaccines to the food. In Brazil, there was a test on putting a cattle vaccine inside of potatoes and carrots so that cattle could get vaccinated without having to give a shot to everything in the herd, which was very expensive, very difficult, and sometimes farmers didn't do it, and you would end up with sick cows that sometimes made it to market. So there's all sorts of genetically modified organisms, not just crops. I'm saying crops because that's what I'm most familiar with and worked with, but also cattle that can produce more milk or more nutritious milk or different types of products. The other problem with the way we do agriculture too is what's called monocropping. We take a popular crop and we just grow giant fields of it. And we do that with several crops. We just in one field grow one particular type of crop, and we've limited ourselves to very few crops. That means we call this agrodiversity. That means we have a select handful of crops that are very productive. Now, not all these crops are eaten. Some of them are used for animal feed. Some of them are used to make other types of products, vitamins, fuel, ethanol, drinks, whatever. Many use. So we have seen a decline in the amount of crop plants that we use, and we're very restricted. And think about starch supplies in this country. Most starch comes from potato, corn, and wheat. There are other sources that even have different types of starches which are better. A lot of the tropical plants like yucca, manahocha, tia, they have starches in them that are much more healthy for you, but are not in demand for us. And they do have a little difference in consistency and texture that we just don't value here in a lot of our culture. And this is true for every country except those that's people that still hunt and gather and do simple, ancestral types of agriculture. So, and the problem when you lose biodiversity, that means if you get one particular type of corn that we grow in the majority, and that corn gets a disease, you could wipe out the whole crop. And that has happened before in this country with cotton, particularly, that's the most famous one, with certain varieties of rice, certain varieties of apple that have just almost got wiped out. We almost lost that whole crop. So diversity is important in agriculture. And I could even say that our diversity, given how we eat animals, is limited too. Crops, not as much. Animals, a little more, which is going to be our next topic. Now, I know we have some vegetarians in the class, and I have some in every one of my classes, every semester, is a big focus in our country is meat production. And in countries like ours, it's unfortunate that we tend to be a very meat-based society. Why meat? Because it's how we get our protein. Meat is a very concentrated source of proteins that complement our own chemical composition of the proteins we need. This is called biological equivalency value, BV. We use this in agriculture a lot to look at the protein content, the nutrient content of the things that we eat. So with meat, what we find in many countries is that we favor our protein from meat, but the problem is This is more of an economic decision. In countries that are economically wealthy, it's expensive to grow meat for that purpose. It's probably cheaper to grow crops, but the thing is, we prefer the meat because of whatever reasons, just our value system. We just find that that's favorable. And we have the money to do it, so the heck with it. You go to other countries where they can't afford to feed the animals because they need that food. So they don't grow animals and they will grow crops. So in countries like ours, is we see that 70%, 70% of our protein probably comes from animals. And 30% probably comes from plants. You go to other areas, and I know I've been to other continents, is that a lot of my diet was probably about 65, 70% of my proteins came from plants. Soybean particularly, gluten rice, not like the rice you get here. It's like the sticky rice that if you use sashimi or sushi, okay? And that was fine for me, except I come from a culture that was very animal based. I mean, we fed the vegetables to the cow and then ate the cow or the chicken. So whatever. My parents did farming, whatever, and because that's what their families did as peasants. Okay, so so in meat production, we have to cover it, even though some of you are opposed to it, and I think it's inefficient way to live. It is something that we have to still keep improving because we're not going to change society right away. But the problems with animal agriculture, and you can read about this. I'm not going to go through this whole slide, but much of the animal agriculture is not so much the space it takes up, but what is involved in the operations is literally you have to have a farm to feed the animals. Where my mom retired to in rural eastern Pennsylvania, she lives around a lot of Amish that grow most of their corn as animal feed. And they also grow crops like milo and other stuff which goes into chicken feed. So they don't grow crops for humans. Now they grow their own, and a lot of the Amish do grow crops to go to market, but a lot of their biggest bang for the buck is to sell their crops for animal feed for outside of the Amish community and within. Some of their animals don't eat the crops they grow. They feed them a little differently when they do raise animals. So understand this, that once you make a step to eating animals and cultivating animals, we're not just collecting wild animals. We're not just corralling animals. We're taking incredible care of them that requires pesticides, vitamins, energy in itself, machinery in itself to get the job done. And we can look at in your book the countries that eat a lot of animal protein, and North America and Central America and South America are some of the biggies. The Caribbean also too, and I can see that. I've been there eating a lot of jerk chicken and beef and whatever, and we had goats and chickens running all over the place, whatever. But some countries just eat a lot of meat. Others do not at a bare subsistence. Sometimes with parts of Asia just out of habit. So let's just briefly look at some of the major, ways we raise livestock. And the thing is that we have to think about is we're looking at very few people raising a high concentration of animals, trying to put in the minimum resources we can, or at least the resources that are expensive, we're putting in the minimum that we can. Because in many of the countries that raise chickens the way we do, clean water is readily available, access to antibiotics and pesticides is readily available, and that's not a luxury sometimes in countries that are still developing. And when we look at this concept of what a CAFO is, it just means a concentrated way of growing these industrialized, animals. So what we look for, particularly with chicken, is that it is inexpensive. You can grow a lot of unit per area, and particularly a lot of pounds per area. Usually in our country, we call these chickens broilers, mostly for meat production. There are chickens, of course, raised for egg production under very similar conditions. And what we're looking at with the type of birds that we breed, these are not wild type animals like pheasants or quails. These are animals that were selectively bred, and in some case GMO, to be to grow faster and larger. And it's even true for any of our agricultural animals. Looking for fatter animals animals that grow larger, animals that require less food. We try to raise them disease-free, but that doesn't always work. So a lot of times we're using pesticides and antibiotics, and we also try to even raise their feed that way too. That means the feed crops that we give them are also bred specifically for that purpose. So chickens are just an example, because this is the most common source of meat in every country I've been in. I've either seen chicken farms or have seen chickens running around all over the place that were grown on family farms. Pork is probably number two. Of course, you don't find it in Middle Eastern countries and several other countries due to dietary restrictions. But for the rest of us, pork is probably next to chicken as far as production goes. And again, we are breeding pigs that are not like the wild pigs, unless you actually go to farms that do that and raise wild pigs. And we're looking at also a very specialized operation that even takes place at a small scale. When I was a professor in northwestern Oklahoma, we were right next to some pig operations in Kansas, and my university did have a school of agriculture. So, and I was a department head at biology and also worked with the school of ag. And we would have people coming in all the time, pig farmers that were looking to borrow microscopes or equipment or even buy old equipment for us so they can do artificial insemination of their pigs. So they would literally take a boar and collect the sperm from it, a prize boar that they bought or raised, and they'd use that boar to fertilize all their pigs because they wanted uniformity. And that's so important too, with any type of animal or crop that we raise. We want what's called this monoculture consistency. We want everything to be very similar. I mean, places like Disney and McDonald's and a lot of other fast food places, Kentucky Fried Chicken, places that serve a lot of food. Yes, Disney, they have their own cafeterias, and they want consistency. They want consistency no matter what country they're in. That doesn't always work. Sometimes I've been around the world and eaten at like, KFCs and places like that just to see what they're like. And sometimes they're required to use local animals and crops, but generally we like uniformity, and this is basically part of you being a consumer. You want to go to a restaurant, a chain restaurant particularly, and have the same, they call it taste sensation and experience from place to place, which to me is not fun. And I don't go overseas to eat at a place I could eat in America and get the same food, but a lot of people do, and it's comforting. And that's true for cruise ships, that's true for Disney, any type of place that entertains tourists. So pork production, again, pigs are probably one of the nastiest to take care of. They're big polluters. The nice thing is that they're easy to feed, okay, and they're even though they're mean, they're kind of easy to take care of too if you can keep them away from each other. But again, this is number two on how we obtain protein in our diet of cultures that use animals as a major source of protein. Beef production is probably number three globally, but in some countries like ours, and we're not the worst. You get into some of the South American countries, which I did, believe it or not, enjoy, because Hungarians and my dad's culture, the Belarusians, tend to have very high meat diets when they can afford it. Okay, but beef production is big, and this for us is a very important industry, and we use a lot of byproducts from cattle too, believe it or not. We use them actually for chemical production, believe it or not. Their digestive system and organs produce medicines, okay, and chemicals we use in cheese production, believe it or not. But their skin, of course, and bone is used for a variety of products, anywhere from leather to actual gelatin and protein supplements. So some of you are taking like supplements, that a lot of that comes from residue from cattle. When I was a production biochemist in industry in St. Louis for a company called Sigma at the time. Now they're Sigma Aldridge, whatever. They've bought out a lot of other companies. But I would have to go to the stockyards and to the places where they butcher the cattle and pigs and whatever, and buy parts from them to use for chemical production, for either research or for clinical products. So cattle have a lot of importance besides, just food, and particularly fast food. And we do, and cattle, there are genetically modified cattle. So most of your cattle are either cloned or specifically bred. That means there's literally one bull in an area and a bunch of females that are literally almost identical. And what happens is that one bull can fertilize tens of thousands of cows through artificial insemination. It's not the way you would think this goes. It's an incredible factory done process that ensures uniformity either for dairy cows or beef cows or particular specialty cows. So, and some cows are just born to be surrogates to a lineage of cows that, that means surrogate moms, basically. They're artificially, they could be embryo implanted if you wanted to. That is done, what's called embryo splitting and embryo implantation. I've seen a workshop on that when I was taking a workshop at University of University of Michigan, I believe it was. It was actually a Minnesota researcher talking about the research he does and the operations that he works with. The problem with cows is their poop is polluting, which can get reused, and their burps and farts produce a lot of greenhouse gas. They are gas producers. They are what we call ruminants. Pigs and chickens don't have that problem. When we start getting into sheep and goat, some of those animals also produce gases that could be pretty much abundant and can destroy our atmosphere, basically. So understand, and when we get to cows too, I mean, watch the video that goes along with this lecture, is that, cattle take a lot of resources, and probably of all the animals, they're the worst. They have the least food to pound ratio that they put on, because people pay attention to this, how much a cow eats, what type of food it eats, and how much fat or meat it puts on as a result of that diet. Usually water we don't pay attention to. Cattle are incredible water users. If you've ever been around them, they do pee a lot. Now, fish is, it depends on where you are. Coastal countries, a lot of Asia, fish is very popular, including fish meal. You'd be surprised how fish meal, that means ground up fish that's used for a variety of products, particularly dog food, and sometimes as fertilizer and protein, and used in protein sources that they call in Asia protein sources. A lot of times it's mixed with soy to make products. So the fish are very big, but not just in the food industry, for oils and other things too. So this is a very big market that is quickly getting depleted, and it is very high tech that uses, like your book says, it uses sonar, GPS mapping, satellites. We have helicopters that go out, and guys, farming in general uses GPS now to track, how plants are growing. You can literally do this from space. You can use what's called infrared satellite technology. We could also use it to track the health of even a herd of cattle using GPS integrated with satellite data. So this is pretty high tech. But fish is one in the United States, which is not too big a deal, but in other countries it's big. And we find countries that send fishing boats out from, let's say, Japan down to Ecuador. And we have Russian trawlers that come, all the way across the Arctic to almost, to Canada and almost to Alaska. Okay, I mean, they have to stay away. There's certain boundary limits, but you have Russian ships that go down almost to Antarctica to get their food. That's a heck of a trip when you think about it. So this is incredible industry. And the problem is it is destructive industry. Our seafood use has grown, not just for eating, but for also the byproducts of fish too. A lot of time fish are ground up to use to feed livestock. This is done a lot in other countries. We've learned we do because it's so difficult to get fish now. We use a process called aquaculture, and aquaculture basically allows us to fish farm. It basically goes back a long way, believe it or not. Catfish are done inland. We find trout farms and bass farms and all sorts of things. You'd be surprised. When I was a prof in Oklahoma, I had a course on my campus that we taught fisheries management, because it was a very popular thing, and the state ran regional fisheries, and we would have fishery people come out and teach the college students, these were master's level students, basically how to go about setting up fish farms for small to large commercial purposes, like walleye, other types of fish, and particularly we see these along the Midwest and all the way to the north, and some of the plain states do this. In Asia, I visited tilapia farms that were grown in volcanic water. We've actually, some students and I helped set up a tilapia operation in Honduras to feed crop waste for poor people to grow their own crops and then grow tilapia as a protein source. So fish is important. And the problem is, of all the creatures, fish, we don't really have many special bred fish. We're just starting now with specialty bred fish and shrimp and other things, but usually these are wild caught, very much like the old hunting and gathering days. So when we start looking at the whole idea of sustainability and how do we make a world there's going to be a reasonable future for the next several generations and beyond, and that we're not going to reach our carrying capacity sooner than we expect, because 2100 is going to be a very bad time. I'm not going to be alive for it. Now 2050, which is called the put on the brakes point, that means the point where if we're not careful we might reach our carrying capacity or limitations in certain resources, and I can see that happening real easily. And if I probably take care of myself, I don't know if I'll live that long, I might be able to see these shortages occur, and then I can just drop dead and say it's not my problem. So by 2050, we have to be careful, because the current way we're doing things, we're going to be running out of food and the resources to raise that food pretty quickly, unless we curb our population, curb our appetites, or find other ways of doing things. And read about some of the details in your book, because we're also looking at, if we keep continuing doing the agricultural operations that we're doing, we're going to also have a lot more pollution to deal with too, and a lot of land loss. So in environmental science, particularly in public health, we have this issue called emerging or emergent diseases. And that means diseases that are becoming very prevalent or are due to some type of human or anthropogenic activity. And one of the bigger ones that has started appearing is the whole idea of antibiotic resistant bacteria in foods. Guys, so when we talk about antibiotic resistance, it means you pick up a bacterium that if you were to take antibiotic, the antibiotic is not effective against killing that bacteria. You're not antibiotic resistant. You're okay. The bacteria are the ones that can't get killed, and then you're not okay. So we have seen a spike in antibiotic resistance that is spreading globally because we use antibiotics during the raising of livestock, sometimes in plants, because we have bacterial diseases of plants that we have antibiotic pesticides that we use too. But the thing is that once these antibiotics enter the food stream, they can be passed out of the animals through urine, through feces, okay, through the carcasses sometimes when they're slaughtered, and this ends up in the environment and can make bacteria in the environment resistant. And if you get this antibiotic in your system, which is very unlikely to pick it up directly from the animal, but if these bacteria get in you, that could be a problem because they can't be treated. And guys, the whole idea of agriculture is when we started agriculture, we also introduced ourselves to what are called zoonotic diseases. That means diseases that the animals had that we now pick up, very much like COVID. It's probably a zoonotic disease. That means a disease we picked up from a close association with animals, either living near animals or being around caged animals, as like in zoos or pets, or just in the agricultural use of animals, living within, reach of animals. So antibiotic resistance is going to be a growing problem. And even in fishery operations, you have to use antibiotics to keep the fish from dying from disease. And even in our own cells, we believe the environment should be sterile and clean and free of disease. So we even overuse antibiotics in ourselves, in soaps, as traditional antibiotic pills, and in other types of ways that we make products that have antibiotic materials in them. Another big ailment we're having is, again, the death of our oceans, the destruction of our oceans. And this is done by overfishing. By overfishing, we screw up the food chains, and then something called bycatch. That means as we're fishing, we accidentally catch other animals in nets and even plants in nets, in lines, and whatever. And there's various ways that you can do fishing. You can spend a whole year learning about fishing operations. And on one of my advisory boards I serve on for coral reefs, we have 3 to 6 representatives sometimes from fishing industries that I work with all the time and respect what they do. The small industries, or the recreational fishing people, and also the commercial, is that they have a job that is driven by consumers, by our needs. And so, and bycatch happens. They do their best to reduce it, but this could really doubly affect the food chains in the oceans, because we see a lot of loss of sea turtles, other marine animals, and sometimes fishing operations in themselves in protected waters, like around coral reefs, can be very harmful too. So fishing does have its ills. It does have its pollution too in the processing of fish. We learned that in Japan with the canning of fish, creating mercury pollution that harmed tens of thousands of Japanese people right after World War II. Now, not so big a problem are the farm-raised fish, particularly those that are genetically modified. And I've seen a couple of these type of fish in Oklahoma. My friend and colleague was testing out genetically modified fish, and sometimes they get out, and that could be a problem. Now, why do we raise these fish like salmon, bass, and some others? Is that they grow quickly, and you can replace them quickly, and it could meet a rapidly growing fish market. So most of these fish are not like fish that have, human brains. There's nothing weird. It's fish that grow quicker on the same amount of feed, and you can get to market real quickly. And sometimes we could raise fish that have different taste. So, I mean, it's all up to what the consumer wants. This is consumer driven. Scientists are not making these for fun. They are doing this with the cooperation of the food industries and genetics companies to make these things that consumers want. So we mentioned a little earlier, is that when we start looking at cropland, and not just cropland, but also pastures, industrial farms, you name it, it is starting to take up a lot of land. And it is what we call the largest of the anthropogenic biomes. The problem is that as cities grow, as suburbs grow, it takes up land that was once farmland. I'm seeing this right now where my mom lives, is that some of the farmers are just giving up because their land, they can't afford to pay the property taxes. They're raising property taxes on their land for the marginal money they get for their crops or their livestock. So they move out, and that becomes then strip malls or apartment houses, that land. And the farmers have to move out to other areas that were once wilderness, where they can get the land for cheap, or abandoned lands, or wild lands that nobody really owns. So this becomes an issue. And we're starting to see the farmland become more industrialized, which means more pollution, more resource use. And guys, as farms move further away from cities and suburbs, you have to have a supply chain that moves that food to the particular area. Okay, and we call this a food system. So, and the thing is the food system for us, and even almost globally right now, is going to be rice, maize, which is corn, and wheat, and in some areas, soybean and potato. Depends on where you are. Europe, it's potato. You go to parts of Asia, it's soybean as their major crops. Wheat is not that big a deal. Sometimes barley in Europe a lot, or rye in Europe a lot. I was not raised with wheat. Okay, I don't like it that much compared to barley or rye. So with food systems, it has to be specialized to the culture, but also it has to be streamlined, and you have to have a specialized system to go along with it, which is why when something breaks down in that system, we could be in trouble, and we could actually see famines. But most of those famines are probably going to affect the poor, like we see in this country when natural disasters occur, like hurricanes and floods, or things like pandemics. And I hate to tell this to our vegetarians and vegans in the class, but unfortunately, as a country develops, we tend to see that with wealth, and better access to food, the role of animal sources, meat sources, grows, and convenience food grows. Guys, I've watched cattle butchered. I've watched my mom and dad butcher a chicken, and we made the cuts in the house. And guys, when that chicken came into the house, it never left. I mean, nothing left the house except through our digestive system. We didn't throw anything out. You ate the heads, you boiled the beak, you turned it into soup. I mean, that's the way people lived. And we didn't throw anything out. When you look at the fast food industry to produce a Kentucky Fried Chicken or Church's Chicken, whatever, a Taco Bell, you know, beef burrito, or a, Big Mac or Whopper, you know, you should see the food waste that comes from this. We throw out a lot of the food that tends to, look bad, have a little off taste to it, which you wouldn't even notice. Sometimes the appearance looks a little funny, or somebody just overbuys and has to throw out the stuff. And also just in the processing, it's sometimes cheaper to throw out meat wastes as you're butchering meat than it is to ship it to someone else to use. And so when we start looking at processed food, guys, we can sometimes waste 30 to 60% of that organism, and it just gets thrown out. Now, guys, and that's an environmental waste. That is disgusting. And fast food adds another link to the whole chain of processing and manufacturing and transporting food. It adds another burden. So if we want to look at meat in general, it is a burden. And just environmentally, it is destructive, much more destructive than if we were just all vegetarians. But the thing is, too, with vegetarianism, you still have that commercial aspect to it, too, and a monoculture aspect. Now, one problem, too, we've discovered with particularly a heavy animal protein diet is the concept of overnourishment. Because I spent twice a week at a workshop run by a colleague of mine. We're not friends anymore because we disagree on a lot of stuff, but he's a world's authority on veganism. He's actually an agricultural ethicist, which don't ever get a PhD in that. There's not many jobs available. My poor friend, Dr. Comstock, moves from university job to university job, but he is brilliant when it comes to looking at the ethical and philosophical systems of meat consumption versus vegetarian veganism. And I've been to a couple of his meetings that we spent a week living in Michigan or Minnesota, wherever we had our meetings. And we would eat that whole week meals that he said were appropriate for a future world. So it was basically vegan meals. And to be honest, it got me sick. I was not used to eating that much bulk and vegetables. I was not used to going to the toilet that much, to be honest. And I would have just rather eaten a hamburger about 1/10 the size of the meal I had on my plate, the vegetarian meal, and just be very happy with it. And did get in trouble once by sneaking out with a couple of colleagues to a taco place. We got reprimanded and banned to our rooms until we were good little professors and whatever else we were, veterinarians. But seriously, so we've run into this concept of overnourishment, where people are not paying attention to the volume of food that they eat. And when you start getting into meats and other stuff like pizza in general, that is much more condensed in calories and in fat than vegetable type foods. So when you start bulking up on this versus getting your protein from vegetables, that gets to be a problem. And we tend to get obesity, and we tend to get a disproportionate amount of nutrients to the point where we can even get what's called imbalanced diets and vitamin deficiencies. So guys, we do have a shifting food culture. And for most of you, you're too young to have seen the food culture shift. I remember the days before fast food. And I remember particularly growing up in an immigrant part of New York City. Okay, we were also lower income. We didn't go to the few fast foods that opened up, except maybe White Castle because they were cheap. And usually they were built in poor neighborhoods because they were cheap. Okay, and we could eat a lot there. Okay, for the same amount as going grocery shopping. So we like processed foods too at home because they're easy to make. I don't mind spending 4 hours cooking a meal, but I know my son, does not. He's a purely microwave it person, and the meal better come in one big packet. Okay, so processed foods, they're easier to handle than fresh foods. They can be stored literally almost forever in supermarkets, shopping, grocery stores, and whatever. And what's unfortunate, I've also seen this shift occur globally in developing countries, where I go to where I think I'm in the middle of nowhere in the Philippines, in China, or in, Colombia, and there's a friggin' fast food restaurant right near a small village. And it's like, darn. And you're starting to see people make their own local processed foods that they sell rather than the fresh foods or just the ingredients. So as countries get wealthy, our culture shifts to this convenience type food, which is what America and then Europe went through as people became wealthy. Because guys, even our poorest of the poor people in developed countries, industrialized countries, are still much better off than either some of the upper middle income people of developing countries or less economically wealthy countries. So guys, the whole idea of food shortages and our changing and shifting diets and the unsustainability of eating, animals, this has been known since the 50s, and it became very popularized in the 70s. And one book in particular, a former girlfriend of mine kept imposing on me because I was going into School of Agriculture, and she thought I should know better. Is she gave me this book called Diet for a Small Planet, and it was a big book at the time. It promoted that we can do vegetarianism, not veganism. I mean, some of it's vegan, but vegetarianism very easily if we were willing to change our attitudes. And she was not a scientist, but she worked with people that dealt with agricultural issues and looked at all the benefits of using plants and compared them to meats. Now, the health factor she was talking about, I didn't necessarily agree with because that was not well researched, and today it still isn't. Okay, and I tend to follow more the scientific, medical, and what's called physical anthropology literature when it comes to the impacts of agriculture on diet and human health. But the environmental aspects are really significant when we look at how we eat, our eating habits. And Diet for a Small Planet is one of many books about this, but it was really the first of the really systematic books that tried to seriously look at, some of the science and environmental, particularly environmental science, behind plant-based diets for humans. Now, the one thing in the book that got me the most about this Diet for a Small Planet was that it was funny because having taken environmental science classes and taken ecology classes and all these science classes about the environment, I never thought about the impacts of agricultural systems, and particularly I never thought about, man, when I'm eating a cow or a chicken or a goat, sometimes we do that, whatever, I never thought about you have to raise food to raise it. And when we look at the amount of protein and calories we get out of a cow, that cow had to get its calories from somewhere else, and that would mean crops that normally I could probably eat. So when we look at a farm field right here, this farm field, okay, if the people in this room are directly eating out of that farm field could feed, let's say, this many people and give them adequate protein, which is important, what's called the BV. That means the equivalent nutrients that we need to model our body. That means that your body needs, basically, I hate to say this, human protein. So if you're going to be a cannibal, that would be a very good source of BV, but that's not, ethical, that, or in many places. Okay, so we could feed a lot of people, but if these people decide to say, I want to eat a cow, that farm field that would feed all of them now goes to feeding a cow, and the food out of that cow only feeds one of those people. So they would have to have many more farm fields to feed all of them to get the certain amount of cows they need to eat. So guys, when a cow eats grass, it loses about 90% of that. 10% is left behind. So if a cow eats 1,000 calories of grass, that makes accessible to us 100 calories. And that's ridiculous. So this is the real environmental science behind this. This is not make-believe. With pork, it's a little more effective. With chickens, much more effective. If you eat other stuff, and we're going to get into this in a special topic, it becomes very, very effective. And as we look for methods of sustainability and how do we look into our future, we're going to look at other sources if you want your animal-type proteins, but have it almost at a point where this farm field can grow those animal proteins and you could feed all those people. So again, another problem, I mentioned this earlier, with the eating of animals. I'm going to keep repeating this because this is so important. And I remember being in developing countries and being slightly fearful of these type of diseases as I ate animals that I would normally not eat. Like guinea pigs and, just weird stuff and, whatever. So, I mean, weird for when I was raised, not weird for the people that are eating it. So, I mean, I'm not going to make that judgment. But as we come in contact with animals closer and closer, particularly domesticated animals and animals like rats that live amongst the domesticated, animals and in the food processing industries, I hate to tell you that, cockroaches and rats, we don't eliminate them. We just lower their number when it comes to food processing and even in food establishments that serve your food. Guys, we come in contact with their diseases. And we know that particularly, guys, humans carry a heavy load of rat, and they left off cockroaches here, and cockroach diseases, because they are there every step of the way, from the food, from raising the crops and the livestock, all the way to processing and shipping, and into the eventual, sitting in a restaurant or even in your house if you have cockroaches. And guys, and sometimes wildlife lives amongst the animals that we raise too, particularly in developing countries. So our association, close association with humans, of humans and animals, has introduced to us dozens of new and fatal diseases and those that can form epidemics and pandemics. And this is the problem that occurred with animal agriculture. As people started living near the animals, not so much hunting and gathering. We do see like a deer disease that's related to mad cow disease that's affecting deer hunters right now, but that's very rare. And believe me, if we raised deer the way we did cattle, we'd probably end up with that disease being pretty common in the human population. So guys, another major concern of big agriculture and using animals as our primary food source is the whole idea of animal welfare. Now, I'm a prescriber to animal welfare. What this means is that we're treating the animals humanely. This does not mean animal rights. So I'm not going to sit down and say, is it ethical or not to eat an animal? Because when I think about this as an environmental scientist, wolves don't sit around worrying about its prey. And cows don't consider that plants or living things, should I be killing it to eat? I mean, that's just part of life. To me, a plant is just like an animal as far as the consideration of eating a living thing. When it comes to welfare, that's important. And believe me, my part of research was looking at plant welfare. How do you treat plants in a way that they're healthy? I hate to say this before we kill them, but with animals, that's a different story because a lot of them do have emotion. They have feelings. They can register pain. And this is very important. So do we have the capability of humanely eating? And I think this is important because these animals are not volunteers. We have forced them into a servitude that they're providing us with a resource, and we should at least give them the right of treating them accordingly so that they're not under stress or duress. And what's really interesting is the first person to really bring this out and do something about it was a autistic engineer. She actually did her graduate work at University of Illinois, where I did mine, of Temple Brandon. And I actually got the pleasure of meeting her once at a conference. And she developed a way of handling animals that eventually got published and whatever for slaughterhouse, that the animals were not under stress. Now, is it done everywhere? No, but she got the patent on it, got very popular for it, and became very famous for it. but she sensed that something was wrong with animals as they were going through the chutes as she was working on her agricultural engineering graduate degrees. Very brilliant, insightful person to talk to, and is equally concerned about human rights too when it comes to various, issues. And to start ending this presentation, something that I've worked with a lot and seen a lot and even experienced it in my own childhood is the whole idea of food inequity, like any other inequity. So guys, we live in a country that we import food from countries where people cannot afford to buy those foods, and they don't have the land to grow food for themselves to begin with. And I find that unfair, and it's true for almost every resource that we use, including wood. A lot of your wood comes from Canada. Not that people are starving in Canada, but they have shortages of wood for their own purposes. So, but when I start looking at really lower income developing countries, that's a shame that there could be a lot of food in that country, but that food is not going to her or her family. The money, the little money she gets, up to some maybe $3 a day sometimes, goes for her to buy cheaper sources of food because this has gotten outpriced or is not available because it's being shipped out. So we need equity. And yeah, you don't see this going on, but what is important is we have to make sure that, particularly when we import food or price our own food, is that we don't put poor people out of existence. And we have these, I'm not going to say fair trade laws, but standards. Standards are just recommended practices that we can give certifications to, which sometimes mean nothing, that say, I am going to do stuff sustainably so that I'm going to have, encourage people or supplement them to grow food for me, but also give them a lifestyle that is not going to be detracted from, that they could also live and benefit, and also not pollute their environment. So if I'm going to have them grow food, I'm going to expect them to use fertilizer, pesticides, other stuff, but have them use more sustainable ways so that their environment's not being polluted. Because why should their environment be polluted for you to eat? Just so you can have food that looks cool and nice and is uniform and consistent. And that's a problem. And there's also markets now for having food that is blemished, that looks funky, that is not consistent. And let's just start using that and just deal with it. And this helps these people, particularly in the countries that grow that food. They have less food waste. And another thing we've seen even in our own country when it comes to equity in food and fair trade is that most of our food is grown away from the people that eat it. So you have a city, and then you have the food, growing far away, and the economics of it gets a little funky. The farmers get money for their food, but most of the economy of that food now ends up here, where the food is shipped and processed and sold, and they end up getting disproportionately more money than them. Plus, they get, excuse me, almost all of the pollution from growing that food. And they're at the and their economics is totally at the supply and demand for here. They can't drive any of that. So if they come up with a creative crop, it can flop. And I've seen that happen over and over again, where farmers or agricultural researchers came up with these beautiful creative crops, and it flopped. And it would have been an economically feasible or sustainable crop, but this environment, which is so far removed from the farm, doesn't do it. So there are ways we can look at also this issue of food and food deserts. So if you're living in this environment, guys, and you're poor, you have very little means of growing your own food or getting locally grown food, which will be cheaper because it takes less effort to ship and it's cheaper to get to you. So local grown is very important. It can't be done totally unless we're all living in villages, but it can be done through special means. So we can locally grow food in greenhouses, but the problem is that gets expensive. And now that crop becomes gentrified and expensive. So the whole idea of growing food locally to help the poor works against it. And unfortunately, in poor areas like where I grew up, our soil was contaminated with lead and other materials from living in a polluted environment. So we were not allowed in New York City to grow crops in our backyards, if we had a backyard, or in a community garden, which some of us had. It was an abandoned house that fell apart, and we had this yard sitting there that we turned into a garden, and we were banned from using it. Today, it's not that bad, but people had to come in and clean that soil up. So growing local and fair trade are okay, but the thing is, in a market like ours, it's very difficult to do, and it takes a lot of cooperation and compromise on the part of the consumer. Another big issue, which we're going to deal with later when we look at solid waste in general, is food waste. Okay, humans at one time used everything that they grew or caught. They found ways of using every piece of that animal or plant, and very much I grew up that way. And now I'm not that way. So today, when we look at particularly packaged food, and when you buy ready-to-eat food and eat at a restaurant, you're looking at the most wasteful way to make food. And our own consumerism, you're going to learn this later, wants food that is uniform, looks good, and is big and juicy, and we do want nutritious food too. But that leads to waste. And this food waste, guys, we waste billions of dollars of food every year just in the US. And almost all of this is consumer driven. And guys, if there are even commercials about marketing of food, it's still based on consumer demand. We can't force people to want something. You can coerce them, well, not really coerce, you can induce them to think they like something, but eventually buying power is what tells us what to do and industry what to do. And this is the problem with food waste in general. And you're going to learn much more about that in detail from a person that works as a food engineer in a European food company, which is very similar to the way we run our food. And guys, another big problem we mentioned earlier too is as you farm soil or raise animals on soil, that soil eventually decays. I remember we took a trip to Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont, and across from Canada, which is all very similar area, and looking at these farms that went back to the 1600s, early 1700s, and most of them were just, the farmers were putting in too much money to fix up the soil, that it wasn't worth their operations anymore. And those areas were disappearing and being turned into housing or recreational areas or parks or whatever, because that's all that land was good for. And even with the conservation service that we have in the United States, the U.S. Department of Agriculture's conservation service, it's still difficult for the massive operations to do what's called minimal soil disturbance. So we try to run tractors less over the soil. We try to find better crops that don't require as much what's called tilling and fertilizing and whatever. We try to find crops that are more resistant to less water, and you name it. So guys, the nice thing about ancient people is they did not grow crops intensively and continuously. And what they would do is move from one field to another and allow a field to rest. We don't have that opportunity anymore. So we're seeing incredible destruction of soils. And older farms that were even done traditional older ways have just fell apart. And you can't farm on those soils anymore. So this is a future that we have to look at. How do we restore soils? And believe me, I've seen research in Syria and Israel where they are farming on deserts and building these artificial soils that are sustainable and reusable over long periods of time. And it can be done without using too many synthetic chemicals. It could be done sustainably, or they wouldn't do it. Because in desert countries particularly, you find this throughout Africa, is their agriculture is very marginable, and they have to make it sustainable using very little money, very few resources. So to end with, later in the semester, we're going to have an assignment where you're going to get a little creative on how do people grow sustainably in this ever urbanizing world. How do we do creative agriculture? How do we feed ourselves? Particularly in more condensed ways, sort of like the way they feed astronauts, put a little food to give you a lot of calories, okay, and nutrients. So there's been various schemes I looked at. I worked on a project with Hofstra University where we had a bunch of students that were developing what were called vertical gardens on buildings. Can they actually grow crops cost effectively and resource effectively to make it worthwhile? And they were designing these hydroponic systems and engineering systems on buildings. And this is already done. And actually, this goes back to old Europe and even in ancient Rome and Asia, where people did something called espaliering. I mean, that's a more modern term, but they grew crop plants on the sides of the houses in the bricks. Now, it wasn't as intensive as something like this. We had tall buildings, but these students showed us this could be done. Why don't we replace meat with vegetable material but make it look like it was meat? So we can take basically a chemical that you can make in a lab that looks like blood, okay, and basically mix it with soy or other vegetable proteins and make it look like, and in some case, taste like a hamburger. Now, we tried Beyond Burger at home. I cooked it in comparison with regular cow burger, and we even tried cow pork mix. I mean, I did this scientifically because that's what you find in a lot of foods. You got to be careful if you're kosher halal. Some burgers do contain pork cut. Okay, but and we found that you can tell the difference. But you know, if I had to eat it, I could. If you put enough condiments on it that you don't totally taste the burger, which is what sometimes happens with regular burgers too. You know, so there are ways of doing this. And guys, and you will hear about ways of making burgers that you would rather not know, of the type of things that we can put in there to supplement the protein and to give you animal-like proteins that sustain humans. So it's possible, and a lot of Asia now is finding synthetic ways of making shrimp and other things. I've had that before. You know, they literally weave the proteins into things that look like animals, put them in a stamp mold, and then color it, and you think you're eating shrimp, but you know you're not. Or you think you're eating, salmon, but you know you're not. And then this is what bothers me the most, is that you can now take animal tissues and grow meat-type fibers in the lab. This is called tissue culture and organ culture. And all you do is take a little biopsy of the animal gets a little needle stick, it goes moo or, cluck or whatever, oink, and then you grow the muscles in a lab and you can grind it up in a hamburger or try to weave it into a meat, which is not that great yet. It's more like eating a chicken McNugget type of thing, but we can get it to the point where we can actually grow it into an actual muscle and serve it as a steak. So this is getting creative, but you got to think about, is this really eating? We're going to get a little further into this again as we look at the overall ethics of how we live and what are some of the options of changing our lifestyles. So our federal government, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and underneath it, the Food and Drug Administration, is working more and more on looking at how agriculture should be changed to affect our sustainability and our personal health. Because, guys, public health is part of environmental science. If people are not healthy, we don't treat the environment healthy. Believe me, that is a very good principle to remember. So we're trying to make things more sustainable, food safer to eat, and whatever. And your government has produced apps for that don't always get funded and continue, but there's phone apps for that and computer apps for that. One is called MyPlate, and this is the really only federally done one that you can actually trust the research on. And it's not going to be fad stuff or anything like that, or just stuff that somebody invented. So a lot of it is scientifically based. And yes, it does vary over time. So don't think it's wrong because it varies, because nutrition changes, our understanding of how the body works changes, and guys, our livelihoods change. We went from a very mobile society to a very sit-on-our-butt society, and that affects how we eat and our nutritional levels and how many calories and types of foods that we need to meet that lifestyle. So there's ways you can follow up. So we're gonna look at bits and pieces of this topic further on in the semester as we get on to different topics.